The Mechanical Wizard. Once upon a time, there was a young engineer called Edward Evesham. Ever since he could remember, he had loved all things mechanical. Bird feeders, candle snuffers, envelope openers, toasting machines, you name it, young Edward had made them in his workshop as a boy, and when he was old enough, he joined the firm of Crane & Sons as a junior designer in the lighting and related appliances department. There, he soon made a name for himself with his work on the Crane & Sons reading lamp and the more exotic retractable bath light with illuminated soap dish. You see, what Edward liked most in the world was to take an invention and improve on it in unexpected ways. Of course, the reading lamp didn't need to shine more brightly the more exciting the reader found the book he was reading, and the retractable bath light didn't need an illuminated soap dish that sank when the bath water became cold. But Edward enjoyed his work and liked nothing more than rising to the challenge of his own inventive imagination. At first, his career at Crane & Sons went well. So well, in fact, that Edward was promoted to the Special Projects Department. Here he worked on some really interesting things you probably won't have heard of. There was the Crane & Sons self-propelling deck chair, which was a special commission for the SS Euphonia, and a top-secret flying horse built for none other than Old Man Crane himself. Unfortunately, this is where the trouble started for Edward. You see, he just couldn't resist adding his own little touches to whatever invention he was working on at the time. Giving the flying horse a head for heights was ingenious, but giving the deck chair the ability to leap 20 feet in the air nearly caused a nasty incident on the SS Euphonia's maiden voyage involving Queen Rita's pet spaniel Mitzi. Edward was called into Old Man Crane's office and made to promise, in front of him and his son Theodore, not to make any more improvements without permission. Theodore was sympathetic to Edward because he was an inventor himself and recognised this talent in others, but even he felt that the line had to be drawn somewhere. Although Edward did promise, he really couldn't help himself. He had long since moved on from plain inventing and was now dabbling in mechanical wizardry. Now, mechanical wizardry, for those of you who don't already know, is where engineering and magic mix. Many inventors don't believe in it, and others are not so persuaded by its practical use, but not Edward. And as an enthusiastic advocate of mechanical wizardry, he soon began experimenting with mystical bolts and self-tightening screws, emotional bookshelves, and invisible lampstands. A lot of this was harebrained and crackpot, but every now and then Edward would make a breakthrough. His self-correcting fountain pen proved a boon to bad spellers everywhere, while his earpiece, especially designed for the hard of understanding, was a marvel. But for every success there was a setback, and it was one of these, the self-improving kettle, which proved to be his downfall. The kettle judged and improved upon its performance every time it boiled, but it turned out to be too self-critical, and a number of them blew themselves up in fits of despair. Edward was asked to leave the firm of Crane & Sons, his promising career in tatters. Theodore Crane was very sorry to let him go, but Old Man Crane's mind was made up. The wayward young inventor would have to leave. In a final act of kindness, however, Theodore Crane recommended Edward to a young explorer called Phineas Pepper, who was looking for an engineer to work on a special contraption he had just taken delivery of. The young explorer was delighted and set Edward to work at once, modifying and improving the Crane & Sons Aeronautical Snow Chariot Mark II, in preparation for Phineas Pepper's maiden flight. Chapter 4. The Firefly Quarterly, page 20. Heir to umbrella fortune gets a soaking. The Quarterly has heard rumours that the Luscombe family of H. Luscombe, makers of fine umbrellas, is none too pleased with its youngest member. Theodore Luscombe Jr. set his science master's trousers on fire as they hung on the washing line, only to receive a soaking as the said trousers were extinguished by an extremely cross headmaster. Look out for further revelations of young Luscombe's career shortly. Hugo had seen nothing like the interior of Neptune's nautical antiques before. Harvey and Sarvy's small cabin in the ice forests of the frozen north was cluttered, and Hugo was always tripping over milk buckets or hitting his head on hanging ladles. But that was nothing compared to the sight which greeted him as he followed Daisy and Lily Neptune down the stairs. There were curious and fascinating objects everywhere he looked. Jawbones of immense fish, seashells of every size and description, brass ship's fittings and driftwood, carved into extraordinary designs and fashioned into ingenious furniture. On one wall, like the trophies of a big game hunter, were the sculpted figureheads of 12 ships. On the other, a bewildering array of anchors and grappling hooks. Fishermen's floats were suspended in draped web-like nets hung from the ceiling above the portholes, nautical lanterns, and several huge harpoons. The driftwood tables and sideboards groaned under the weight of deck quoits and cannonballs, chunks of coral and strings of razor-sharp shark's teeth. Littering the floor were coils of anchor chains and stacks of barnacle-encrusted sea chests, which created an intricate maze through which Daisy and Lily picked their way, their long dresses swishing as they trailed along the floor. "Welcome to Neptune's nautical antiques," said Daisy, brightly, settling herself at one of the least cluttered tables and picking up a large teapot with an anchor printed on its lid. "I can't tell you how delighted we are to have you," said Lily, joining her sister at the table and pulling up a sea chest for Hugo to sit on. She held out a teacup with an anchor design on it while Daisy poured some tea and offered it to him. "You know, I find it endlessly fascinating," she said thoughtfully. "Some things which get lost at sea travel such immense distances. Some remain on the seabed precisely where they went down, while others," she looked at Hugo through her large green spectacles, "they wash up right back where they came from." She smiled kindly. "Come now, Hugo dear, drink your tea before it gets cold." Hugo took a sip of the hot, sweet-tasting tea and felt its warmth flow down into his stomach and along his arms and legs right to the very tips of his fingers and toes. He took another sip. His scalp tingled, his cheeks flushed. It was the most delicious drink he had ever tasted. All his strength seemed to be returning to him. Before he knew it, he had drained the teacup to the dregs, and Daisy was pouring him another. "Camomile's pick-me-up tea," she smiled. "It never fails, Hugo, my dear." Hugo smiled back, then said, "You seemed to recognise me when I told you my name." He shifted on the sea chest, which was covered in barnacles and rather uncomfortable. "Are we related?" The sisters exchanged looks at each other through their green spectacles. "I suppose we are in a way," said Lily, lifting the hem of her long skirt and swishing her wide, fishy tail. Hugo gasped. "But you're a mermaid," he exclaimed. "Precisely," Lily smiled. "We were your mother's mermaid godmothers." "That's like fairy godmothers, but fishier," added Daisy. "My mother," said Hugo, swallowing hard. "Tell me about her. I never knew her, you see. She was eaten by polar bears, and I was rescued by snow giants and brought up by reindeer herders." "Polar bears?" said Lily, tears glistening behind her green spectacles. "Snow giants? Reindeer herders?" said Daisy, taking off her own spectacles and dabbing at her eyes. "We feared the worst. We begged her not to go, but she wouldn't listen. Headstrong she was, just like dear Wilfred, her father. And now, after all these years—" Lily grabbed Hugo and hugged him tightly. "Phillida was headstrong, certainly," she sobbed, "and she was also beautiful and brave and loved collecting stories." "Just like her father," interrupted Daisy. Lily hugged Hugo even tighter. "She must have loved you very, very much." Hugo looked up at Lily Neptune. He could see his own face reflected in her green spectacles. "How do you know?" he said in a small, croaky voice. Lily's eyes filled with tears again. She let go of Hugo and picked up the blanket that had been lying neatly rolled beside the driftwood table. "Because of this," she said.
Shoulder bone shake hold and take hold. Somebody should take you home.